In this video, we will cover histology of the digestive tract, as well as some introductory information. First off, it is responsible for ingestion, all the physical and chemical breakdown of our food. That is going to start in the oral cavity, actually, and it will terminate at the anus. So we're talking about that entire continuous tube and all of the different things that happen to ingested material at various points. We're going to do things like absorb water and nutrients, synthesize vitamins, and of course eliminate material that cannot be digested. So 2 concepts to know. We have the digestive tract, which sometimes you'll see referred to as the alimentary canal. This is a continuous tube starting in the mouth and terminating at the anus. So this entire thing is the digestive tract. Sometimes this will be further divided into the gastrointestinal or GI tract. And based on the name, you might be able to guess that is going to be everything from the stomach through the intestines. So stomach, small intestine, and large intestine or colon. And then it will also terminate at the anus. Next lab, we will talk about accessory organs. So there are some exocrine glands and organs that will aid with digestion, but they are not directly interacting with food. So that's a little sneak peek for next lab. And before we dive into the histology, I also want to show you this really fun picture here. So I love these kinds of side-by-side comparisons of carnivorous versus herbivorous versus other kinds of digestive systems. Our digestive system is really weird, and depending on what kind of animal you are analyzing, it might look very different. For example, carnivores have a pretty basic stomach and a generally short colon and a short small intestine. The reason for that is they are generally consuming really high quality foods, mainly protein, that are very bioavailable. So there isn't a lot of processing that their intestines have to do in order for them to get nutrients from that food. Herbivores are dealing more with low quality foods. And by low quality, I mean they're not very bioavailable. You can't get a lot of energy from them. They're not high in fat or protein generally. So instead, herbivores are going to have more complicated stomachs. Usually they'll have a much longer small intestine, and then they also typically have a longer colon. And this just allows the ingested material to take a longer path through the small intestine so that we can really maximize how much nutrients we are absorbing from the small intestine and then from the colon. Humans are interesting. They kind of lie somewhere in between. So we have a longer small intestine, but our colon looks a lot like a carnivore colon would. And this is actually a hot point of debate. We don't actually know whether humans are meant to be carnivores, herbivores, or more likely somewhere in between, omnivores. And it's really interesting being able to look at a digestive system like this and make those conclusions. All right, so just a little fun exploration for y'all. The focus of today will be on the GI tract. So there is histology we can look at in the esophagus. But the main idea to know is we're going to see the same layers through the entire digestive tract. So kind of from the esophagus downward, we're going to see the same pattern. However, there is more to look at with structures of the GI tract, stomach, small intestine, and colon. So that is where we'll spend our focus today. But let's talk about those 4 layers. So really we could take any slide, esophagus, stomach, small or large intestine. Today I've just chosen the esophagus to start. So this guy has 4 layers, like all of our digestive tract will. The layer closest to our lumen, if we find this white space here, that is our lumen. This first layer we encounter is called the mucosa. And sometimes you'll see this term mucous membrane. Our mucosa is a type of mucous membrane, so it is actually creating mucus to help move things along our gut tube, as you'll sometimes hear it called. And there are actually specialized cells within the mucosa called goblet cells. We probably won't be able to see them from this kind of slide, but just recognize that there are goblet cells producing mucus within our mucosa to help create that component of our mucous membrane. Typically, we will also see villi and microvilli lining our lumen, so we'll take a look at some of those as we move further down the gut tube. Those just help to increase surface area for absorption. So one of the areas that we will see those is in the small intestine. Other layers in here, so if we want to get really specific, there is a layer of epithelium, just a tiny little layer of connective tissue under that, and then we have a sublayer called our muscularis mucosa, smooth muscle. All of those things are found within this mucosa. So when we zoom in on our slide, for example, if we look at the small intestine, we'll have the same layers, and I don't want you to let those sub-layers confuse you. All of this is mucosa, even though we have those subdivisions of epithelium and connective tissue and smooth muscle. So that's layer number 1. Layer number 2 is called our submucosa. So that is going to be underneath the epithelium. So this is our epithelial layer. It's going to be underneath that lamina propria, underneath our muscularis mucosa. So all this is mucosa, and then bam, we're in the submucosa, which is a little lighter stained. So our submucosa is also mostly connective tissue. Typically, it'll be dense irregular connective tissue and loose areolar connective tissue. And this layer is also pretty busy. There are a lot of blood vessels running through our submucosa. Just like the rest of our body, the digestive tract needs to have a steady blood supply. So that is going to be just a thin layer of lighter stained tissue, connective tissue. Underneath that, we have our muscular layer. So we have a muscularis externa. Externa because we're moving more externally away from that lumen. We will typically have an inner layer of circular smooth muscle and then an outer layer of longitudinal smooth muscle. And these guys will run perpendicular to each other. So this will look a little different on a slide, but this first layer we see is going to be circular. And then you'll notice that the next layer over kind of has a different pattern. What's actually happening is the fibers run perpendicular to each other. So when they contract, they actually help to kind of ring the gut tube to help push food along. And that is called peristalsis. That's how these contractions help to propel food through our digestive tract. So these two are going to be that muscularis external layer. So layer number 4 is a little trickier to see. This was mentioned on our small intestine model, so I recommend looking at that video as well. So I may just be talking about this theoretically. Looks like it. Okay, so there is always an outermost layer. I'm having trouble finding a slide with it, but beyond this muscularis externa, we typically have another layer of either serosa or adventitia. And whether we have one or the other depends on where we are in the digestive system. So serosa is a serous membrane, and what that means is it is going to have a lubricating function. So anywhere that we have intestines maybe rubbing up against each other or against that mesentery or omentum, we want to have a serous membrane to decrease friction. So examples where we will see a serosa are in the stomach or the small intestine or most of the colon or the large intestine. The esophagus is kind of different in that rather than having it slide against other things, we actually want to anchor the esophagus with an adventitia. So this other term, adventitia, this is going to be found wherever we want a secure connection with connective tissue. The way I remember it is adventitia starts with an A, so does anchor. So I like to remember that the adventitia is going to anchor structures. So in addition to the esophagus, we will see that parts of the colon as well as the rectum are anchored by adventitia. So it's just a slightly different term depending on where we are in the digestive tract and also what that tissue has to do. So I want to focus today on the stomach. Yes, the oral cavity and the esophagus are still part of the digestive tract, but the most different histology to look at is going to be found within the GI tract itself. So we're going to start by looking at the Human Protein Atlas. They have a really nice stomach section for us. All right, so here we go. So right away you'll notice this is a cross-section of the stomach. We've got our lumen over here. So if we zoom out a little bit, this is kind of the opening of the stomach. So the stomach is not distended right now. We can see those rugae, those folds in the stomach that are going to increase surface area for absorption. We have our mucosa, so that's going to be that first layer facing the lumen. Submucosa, in this case, it's still a thin layer and it's typically lighter stained than the rest of the tissue. So it's subtle here, but you can see that this is a lighter purple than the mucosa or the underlying muscular layer. For the stomach, we actually have an additional layer within our muscularis externa, and that is one of the main differences from the rest of our GI tract. So within our muscularis externa, which is the last most external layer we will be able to see on this kind of slide, we have this oblique layer. Let's contrast that with the next layer down, circular layer. We won't be able to tell from our slide, but it is technically running perpendicular to that oblique layer. What we can notice is the fiber pattern disappears. So where we had this kind of oblique pattern before, we don't have that pattern now. And then lastly, we have our longitudinal layer, and we would expect this layer, again, to run perpendicular to the others. And that way, when they contract, they can really help us to wring and kind of churn the contents of the stomach. So main difference here is we have that additional oblique layer. It is typically really thick like this, so it's much larger than those other two layers. And then the last thing of note with the stomach is within the mucosa. Functionally, the stomach is going to create chyme, which is a lovely term for food once it has been mixed in with substances, secretions of the stomach. And part of the secretions are formed by cells within our mucosa. And we have this structure called a gastric pit. So what we've done is we've zoomed in on the mucosa. We get real close here. And then we have, nicely labeled, our gastric pit. So these are tiny crevice-like depressions that lead to gastric glands. So a little further down, we're going to have our gastric gland. You may notice this looks similar to other glands where we've got layers of epithelium surrounding an opening, a tube. And then we also have other cells that are going to secrete pepsinogen and hydrochloric acid. So altogether, they are going to assist with that chemical breakdown of food. We are not going to worry about trying to find those chief cells or parietal cells, but just understand there are kind of three secretions of the stomach that help to break down food at this point. So to review, things to look for in the stomach are that additional oblique layer within the muscularis externa, as well as the presence of these crevices, these gastric pits that are going to lead to our gastric glands a little deeper.